Nestled into the steep, rocky incline of Roquebrune-Cap-Martin on the French Riviera, overlooking the restless waves of the Mediterranean Sea, stands E-1027, a house born of love, haunted by loss, and scarred by obsession. Built by visionary architect Eileen Gray in the throes of a passionate partnership, it was meant to be a sanctuary of modernity. Instead, it became a witness, a silent observer to the unraveling of love, to desecration at the hands of a rival, and to the stains of war and hedonism that bled through its walls. I'm Amy Devers, and this is Clever Confidential, where we dig into the lesser-told stories of the darker side of design, the shadowy, sometimes sordid tales hiding under a glossy topcoat of respectable legacy. This is Episode 5, Eileen Gray and the Aura of E-1027. With me today, as always, is writer and editor Andrew Wagner. Together, we'll unravel the story of E-1027, a house with a soul, where beauty met betrayal, and every stone whispers of the lives it sheltered, and the darkness it couldn't escape.
Clearest skies.
Eileen Gray built her beachside hideaway with her lover, Romanian architect and writer John Bottavici, in 1929, doing much of the literal heavy lifting herself, lugging stone and timber up the rocky path to the foundation right alongside the other construction workers. Situated just outside of Monaco, Gray had envisioned this retreat as a place for her and Bottavici to escape the wilds of 1920s Paris. But Bottavici was 15 years younger than the then 51-year-old Gray, and seemed more intent on bringing the roaring 20s to the Riviera, perhaps hastening the star-crossed lovers' eventual split in 1932, just 3 years after the house's completion. Despite the couple's relatively short-lived romance and its rocky end, the love and care that went into the design and construction of the house is undeniable, beginning with its official name, E-1027. E for Eileen, 10 for J, the 10th letter of the alphabet, for Jean, 2 for B, the second letter of the alphabet, for Bottavici, and 7 for G, the 7th letter of the alphabet, for Gray. E-1027 has served as the backdrop for some of history's more compelling and oftentimes horrific events. Eileen Gray never officially became an architect, but in her 40s, encouraged by John Bottavici, who had first met Gray while writing about an exhibit featuring her furniture work in the early 1920s, she delved deeply into the study of architecture, the mother of all arts. The two fell for each other, and their influences quickly rubbed off on one another. Bottavici was close friends with Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, better known as Le Corbusier, and Gray was fascinated with him. Gray was born to an aristocratic, artistic family in Enniscorthy, Ireland, in 1878. She spent her first 11 years of life roaming around the family's stately Georgian mansion, admiring its functional interiors and broad, tall windows, intended to capture every bit of sunlight the gray, overcast Irish countryside would relinquish. In Corbusier's work, Gray could see the echoes of her childhood, though quite a bit more austere and stripped down. Drawn to the pure functionality of Corbusier's manic precision, his influence would become apparent as she began sketching the first cross-sections and elevations of E-1027 in 1926.
But Gray was far from a starstruck fangirl and had strong opinions about modernists' typical disregard for the interiors of their structures. She was, after all, a classically trained painter, furniture designer, and interior designer, credited with the design of what has been called the epitome of Art Deco, the Rue de l'Otat apartment of society darling Juliette Levy in 1917. So while E-1027 began to take shape in a definitive international modern style, the interior displayed Gray's lovingly restrained, lavish touches. The soft pinks and dark blues of the living room walls, and the aqua greens of the guest bedroom, and the deep red of the exterior doorway were decidedly unmodern. but mostly it is the house's intimate scale that belies its stark white, ornament-free exterior. And perhaps this is what caught the attention of E-1027's biggest fan, Le Corbusier himself. As Jason Sayer wrote in his 2019 Metropolis article, The Sordid Saga of Eileen Gray's E-1027 house, quote, "Inside, the house refrains from using an open plan. Its interior spaces aren't immediately revealed. Rooms are private places waiting to be discovered. Entering either the bedroom or living room cum boudoir, for example, requires walking around a series of corners. Furthermore, given the house's compact size, 1,400 square feet, and many rooms, Gray was meticulously efficient with space. Such constraints, as is commonly the case, led to delightfully innovative workarounds. Wardrobes open to become walls, the living room sofa turns into a bed, and a whole host of cupboards and other bespoke furnishings are either embedded or intrinsically in tune with the rest of the house," unquote. Corbusier would visit Gray and Bottavici in Roquebrune-Cap-Martin, enjoying the sun, the waves, and of course E-1027. Corbu coveted the house very early on, and throughout the years tried desperately to buy it, to no avail. In 1932, after Gray and Bottavici split, and Bottavici got the house, Corbusier became a regular visitor, and this is where E-1027's trajectory would take the first of its many tragic turns. As Corbu became more and more comfortable in the house, he seemed intent on making it his own, removing Gray's influence in bombastic and surprising ways. Gray had created the interiors to be a respite from the loud and raucous streets of Paris. So in 1938, Corbu painted over them, apparently in the nude, with the loudest Picasso-influenced murals he could come up with, depicting sex acts in garish colors. Corbusier was no Picasso. It was as if, as architecture critic Rowan Moore noted in 2013, Corbusier was marking his territory, quote, like a urinating dog, unquote. As World War II engulfed Europe in the late 30s and early 40s, E-1027's next indignity featured Nazis using its exterior as target practice. And then, in August of 1965, death would come knocking as Corbusier would drown at the beach below as E-1027 peered on. Though his death would prompt renewed interest in the area, and in particular E-1027, it could not stop the spate of despair the house would play host to.
In 1956, John Bottavici passed away, and the house was bought by a wealthy Swiss widow named Marie-Louise Chelbert. Chelbert died in the 80s, and somehow her morphine-addicted doctor, Peter K.G., inherited it, using it as an international party pad, replete with orgies and junkies. To help fuel his questionable pastimes, he sold off all of the original Eileen Gray furniture she had created specifically for E-1027. This kept the lights on until 1996, when KG's lights were permanently turned off when he was murdered at E-1027 during one of his parties. And then, E-1027 was abandoned, sunk into a terrible state of disrepair, and had become home to a seemingly never-ending rotation of squatters. In 1999, the house was purchased by Conservatoire du Littoral, and several attempts were made at restoration, though none stuck until Cap Moderne, a nonprofit established in 2014 to manage E-1027, as well as Le Corbusier's small rustic cabin he had built above the house, stepped up. Finally, in 2021, the house has been given the dignity it has always deserved but could never quite muster itself. E-1027 has been fully renovated and is now open to the public. Corbusier's murals remain intact, a fitting tribute to the wild tales Eileen Gray's house has borne witness to. To help us understand this story from a more nuanced perspective, we talked to Anthony Flint, author of Modern Man, The Life of Le Corbusier, Architect of Tomorrow. He's also a correspondent for Bloomberg City Lab and the Boston Globe, and host of the Land Matters podcast. Welcome, Anthony.
I have been a journalist for most of my career. I was at the Boston Globe from 1989 to 2005, writing about the built environment, about architecture, urban planning, urban design. And I wrote a book about Le Corbusier called Modern Man. I was interested in this man and his career, and that's what led me to this wonderful story in the south of France.
And you've been there, correct?
Yes, I've had the just absolute privilege on 2 occasions. One was researching the book. It's just a magical place. And when you visit E-1027, which anyone now can do, it's just like this incredible experience. I don't know if you've ever been to Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in Pennsylvania, but it's similar to that, where you can really see what the architect had planned and executed for the comfort and pleasure of the inhabitants of that house. It's on a steep hillside, and it's up on pillars, and it's kind of like a 2-story white box. And you walk in the front door on the north side, up the hill, and you're greeted by the phrase, "Entrez lentement," which is enter slowly. So this was a beach house message, which was leave your cares behind and, take it easy. And there's a hammock over here, and, you can read your book on the terrace and just really experience the present. I mean, it was almost Zen-like, the way that she designed how you experience that villa. It had everything, the interior furnishings. She, of course, she kind of made her name designing furniture, including a chair that drew its inspiration from the Michelin Man, right? So it's this sort of tubular construction and very comfortable. So it was the perfect mix of being new and interesting and modernist and streamlined, but also comfortable. This was a place where you could really relax, and it was all of those things working together: the interior design, the art of the furniture, the built-ins, and then, of course, the windows. When you look out the windows, you're looking over the Mediterranean. You can see Monaco in the distance. It's just an incredible experience. So we should start with Eileen Gray. She was the daughter of Irish aristocracy and marched to her own drummer, went to Paris, and she was a talented artist. She made sculpture and furniture and was very successful. And you got to remember, this is Paris in the 20s. This is the roaring 20s, and it was quite a time to be there, and sort of part of that arts and literature group that included Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and Picasso, and it was really quite a scene. So she became successful enough and was wealthy enough that she sought a getaway and landed on this part of the south of France, Roquebrune Cap Martin. It's right next to Monaco and Monte Carlo, and right at the Italian border, if you can picture that. So it's this incredible coastline, very steep hillside, beautiful turquoise water. It's just a magical place. And she had met Jean Barravucci, who was an architecture critic, I guess you could say. He was really a bon vivant, and together they had a relationship and said, let's build a house together. And they settled on this location, Roquebrune Cap Martin, and on this hillside, which was sort of covered with banana palms and lemon trees, and it was very rustic place to build. Eileen Gray really kind of self-trained as an architect and engineer and conjured this modernist villa. And together with Jean Barravucci, she was thinking that this would be a romantic getaway for them, and she built it really with the help, of course, many others. But she was right there. She built it herself, essentially. She was right there with the wheelbarrows coming in and a lot of attention to the details that she wanted. So that was Eileen Gray's story, and that's the origins of E-1027, and the story unfolds from there.
I was reading about where she grew up and that she grew up in this sort of Georgian mansion, and this idea that, the Georgian form of architecture was really, if you look at it and strip it down to its basics, it's very modernist, very boxy, all about getting the natural light. And I thought that was just really intriguing because you would think it would be hard to escape that past, but she seems to have really taken it and done something different with it.
Yeah, she put her own twist on it, much like Le Corbusier, who was steeped in classical architecture and, traveled to Greece and the ruins and really had a sense of the evolution and history of architecture. But both of them were trying to make a break from the past, and especially the late 19th century Victorian era of ornament and of especially dressing things up of the interiors. If you picture a Victorian interior, you think heavy drapes and beads and a lot of knickknacks. And I think you're right. I think that the fundamentals were there that she built on, but the modernist task was to strip away that kind of ornamentation and get a bit more minimalist while still serving the needs of the inhabitants of the buildings. So she put that twist on what she had grown up with, and it's really quite a statement. I've said in my book, Modern Man, that Villa Savoye was sort of the architectural equivalent of an iPhone, and E-1027 was very much like that when it was completed in 1929.
Gray was very influenced by Corbusier, correct?
She was aware of him, certainly, in Paris in the 20s. And she quibbled with his mantra that a house was a machine for living in. She viewed buildings as a little bit more akin to a living organism. And they had many of the same goals, but they sort of differed about, the overall philosophy. They kind of circled around each other a little bit like tigers in a cage. They didn't do too much of this publicly, but Eileen Gray did criticize this notion of houses being a machine for living in, which I'm sure ticked off Le Corbusier.
Right. I've heard it referenced a bit as she, again, a lot of respect for his work and his structures, but then she layered on this sort of sensualism and this humanistic layer to it.
Yes, it's so wonderful. And of course, people without these, like outsized egos, it would be, hey, the more the merrier. This is great. It's creative. It's wonderful. But of course, you had this sort of sense of competition and a, somewhat overbearing male orientation or sense of competition. Like, who is this woman who created this structure? How could she possibly know as much as me?
Can you share some background on Gray, Bottavici, and Le Corbusier and how all of their relationships intertwined, both professionally and personally?
Well, it was kind of like a three-way relationship, but without the actual sex. But I'm sure, there was a lot of sexual tension. So, all right, Eileen Gray and Jean Bottavici They built this house. They envisioned it as a place that they could get away to. But then the relationship started to deteriorate. She wanted to just hang out. He really wanted to party. And, he would keep inviting people over. And finally, she said, the heck with this. They more or less split up. And then she actually went over to Menton, which is the last town in France before the Italian border, and started working on another house. She kind of like started over. And that left Jean to be the owner of Villa E-1027. And he was pals with Le Corbusier, so he invited him down with his wife, Yvonne, to hang out. And that was Le Corbusier's introduction to Roquebrune Cap Martin. And he loved it and stayed there in the 30s. And that's when the trouble began. Roquebrune Cap Martin had become sort of like a hidden gem in the sense that, various other glitterati would end up settling there. Coco Chanel, for example, built a villa nearby. It was like an incredibly hip version of Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, right? For the avant-garde of the time. So Le Corbusier just absolutely ate all of that up, and he appreciated Villa E-1027. There are these wonderful pictures of him sort of hanging out and in various states of undress and repose. Just absolutely loved it. Incredible views. And he was actually really using it the way it was intended, right? But he decided that the place needed a little livening up. So he painted a series of racy, sexy murals on several of the white interior walls. One of them is kind of a depiction of his wife, Yvonne, and she's smoking a cigarette and sort of leaning back. You have to really, like a lot of modern art, you have to really look at it. It's somewhat Picasso-like, Cubist. In the arc of art history, it was actually pretty cool. But Eileen Gray didn't appreciate it because she meant for the walls to be white. And here was this guy coating her house with these racy murals.
It seems sort of hostile to deface somebody's work like that. And then at the same time, I can imagine if she's kind of already left and Bottevici's more the owner of this place and they were using it as a party pad, I can see why they would think that would be a good idea. But in some respects, there seems to be a lack of actually respect.
Respect, absolutely.
Yeah.
He has had nothing if not gumption, shall we say. I mean, can you imagine? You have somebody stay in your beach house and they take it upon themselves. Now, of course, he's the pioneer of 20th century modernism, right? So it was pretty high quality work, but it was still, in the view of Eileen Gray, essentially vandalism. It's hard to know, but he I think, kind of intended it that way. He had a brief explanation. They exchanged letters about all this, and he was just saying he was trying to improve on the interior and had these various other rationales. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was pretty provocative.
Would that have been to provoke, to start discourse, to have a back and forth, or was that just meant to maybe sort of put her in her place?
It's hard to know. Maybe a little bit of that. He was the ultimate type A personality, and back in Paris, he was getting international fame, but he was still chasing commissions, and he was incredibly hard worker. And so when he took off for the south of France, I think he really let it all hang out. He kind of, relaxed a little bit, maybe thought in a different way in terms of his creative process. And, like some people go and do watercolors, and he just happened to do it on the white wall. So when Bottavici kind of takes ownership and then has Le Corbusier and his wife Yvonne over. They go down there as much as they could through the 30s, and then there's World War II. And then it was left in a state of a disrepair through the 50s. It transferred to another owner, and it was never really kept up. Le Corbusier came back to the south of France in the 50s. He was building Unité d'Habitation in nearby Marseille. That's that big apartment building that's kind of like the model for high-density apartment buildings throughout the world and in the U.S. And he, of course, fondly remembered Roquebrune and Cap Martin. So he came back over and hung out with a guy named Rubatato, who was a plumber from Nice and ran a little restaurant called L'Étoile de Mer. And Le Corbusier and Yvonne would go there and eat sea urchins and smoke cigarettes and drink wine. And the entire time, this is in the early 50s, Le Corbusier is thinking, I just want to buy E-1027 and make it my own. But he could never close that deal.
How could he not close that deal? I mean, that seems a little strange to me. A famous architect can't buy an abandoned house.
The successive owners just refused to sell it to him. They just wouldn't talk turkey about it. So he built his own little cabin, the Cabanon, right next to L'Étoile de Mer. Le Corbusier's Cabanon, which is this sort of Thoreau-like 12 by 12 log cabin, essentially.
Oh, wow.
That was what he decided was going to be his getaway, much to the chagrin of Yvonne, because they were in this perpetual state of almost like camping out. And it was like being in a cabin on a luxury ocean liner.
We're getting to something. Now we have to talk about Le Corbusier's death. There's some mystery surrounding that as well.
He makes some references in various interviews where he says, I'm going to end my days here. I love it so much. And back in Paris, he had a number of serious talks with his doctor and who detected looming heart problems. And he had a couple of incidents, and Le Corbusier would walk down to the beach and go for his swim. So the question is whether he went for a swim on that day, knowing that it was potentially suicidal. But the fact is he went for his walk, down the steep hillside onto this wonderful crescent beach. And there are all these jagged rocks all around. Dove in, went to swim out, and then the analysis was that he essentially, had a heart attack while he was out on swimming, and managed to get himself back to the beach, but it was too late by the time he had been discovered. So it's a very dramatic ending for this very interesting man. So that's how E-1027 eventually was abandoned, but still eluded Le Corbusier, who very much would have liked to have just bought it, but he could just never close that deal. Ultimately, the fate of E-1027 was it just ended up being abandoned and dilapidated, and the one successive owner actually was murdered in the building in a sultry tale, according to police, that may have involved a estranged lover, but then there were squatters living there through the 60s and 70s. And then it was only fairly recently that there was this recognition that there's this incredible house there, and there's this incredible story on this little patch of hillside in Roquebrune Cap Martin. There's a lot of talk about fixing up all of this stuff so that visitors could come see the Cabanon, L'Étoile de Mer, and E-1027. And really, the thing that made this whole thing turn around was Michael Leakerman, who is a British entrepreneur. He founded the furniture company Habitat, which is sort of kind of like a UK version of IKEA. And he is drawn to Roquebrune Cap Martin, and he actually befriends Robert Rebutato, who is the son of the owner of La Toile de Mer that Le Corbusier had befriended. Leakerman and the younger Rebutato worked together to turn pretty much the entire area into a living museum. And that is what gives us what's called Cap Moderne. And in the meantime, this whole process got a bit of a boost thanks to a movie called The Price of Desire. It wasn't terribly successful at the box office, but it was supported by Julian Lennon. It featured Alanis Morissette, and the villa, E-1027, is fixed up so that it can be the appropriate setting for this film. So they all came together, the film, the restoration work, and now today we have this coherent visitor campus that reflects all of these kind of twists and turns of 20th century modernism and the drama of these various genius figures.
One thing I think we're so taken by it is this idea of this one rather small piece of land that just continually draws these people there, that full of drama and full of life and full of passion. And it's really interesting that it has this sort of mystical, magical qualities that people are continually drawn back to.
It's kind of strange in a way, but it is unquestionably beautiful, and it clearly drew these incredibly colorful and genius characters to its magical environment. There was, just something about it. And when you do go there, you can smell the lemon trees and the salty air. It's the whole package.
Just to bring it back to Eileen Gray for a second, do you think there would have been something visionary about her selecting that piece of land for this essentially very modernist, but also kind of humble beach house, right? It was not pretentious or enormous. And she would have had to work very hard to tame this landscape in order to build this house.
I absolutely picture Eileen Gray sort of bushwhacking through the banana palms and working with the workers, with her wheelbarrow and just, literally getting her hands dirty and actually building this house. And, must have been a very tough lady, just determined in this wonderful way. When you go to visit there, you go to this little visitor center that's near the train station. And then the first building you go through on the tour is Eileen Gray's E-1027. So Le Corbusier, in that sense, gets second billing, or, he's ultimately the star of the show, maybe. But what you see first is her creation. And, that leads you to think. E-1027 was completed in 1929. Le Corbusier built his Cabanon in the 50s. And some of the built-in features, you kind of wonder, maybe he took his cue from her. Isn't that possible? So,
oh yeah,
he might have been copying her. Who inspired who?
I think it is so interesting again that this house, it lived so many lives and died a few times, but was brought back to life. And so I think, it's not an end to the story. It'll be exciting to see where the story goes from here.
Despite the countless twists and innumerable turns, the legendary backdrop and historic characters, the troubling story of E-1027 is, sadly, not very unique at all, even today. Corbusier's egomaniacal, misogynistic insistence on exercising his domineering personality over Gray's masterwork is a story as old as time itself, We've seen it repeated again and again, from Hollywood to Silicon Valley, to Wall Street, to conference rooms of so many industries across the world. The context might change, the tune might sound different, but as Led Zeppelin taught us, the song remains the same. Fortunately, thanks to the Cap Moderne Association, one of Gray's crowning achievements, if not the crowning achievement, is not merely remembered in photos and words, but can be visited in real life. Today, the monumental story encompassed in this small house stands proudly overlooking the Mediterranean, including Corbusier's crass contributions. But rather than sullying Gray's work, Corbusier's murals serve to highlight her subtle yet ingenious architectural interventions within this jaw-dropping landscape, and her furniture's intervention within the serene architectural space she created. A reminder that one need not shout to get their point across. Thanks for listening to Clever Confidential. To see images of Eileen Gray's E-1027 house and more, head to cleverpodcast.com. While you're there, you can fill out our listener survey and listen to the first 4 episodes of Clever Confidential. If you like Clever Confidential and want to hear more, please support us by sharing this episode with your friends and leaving us a 5-star rating or a kind review. Sign up for our Substack newsletter to get notified of new episodes, and consider pledging a paid subscription to support Clever. We also love hearing from you on Instagram and LinkedIn. You can find us at Clever Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Clever on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now to make sure new episodes turn up in your feed. Special thanks to Anthony Flint for being our guest and bringing the E-1027 history to life. Our huge thanks to Mark Zorowinski for editing and sound design, and to Ilana Nevins for heavy-duty production assistance. Our theme music is Astronomy by Thin White Rope from their album In a Spanish Cave, courtesy of Frontier Records. Clever Confidential is produced by Devers Endeavors. Be sure to check out our other show, Clever, for revelatory conversations with creative visionaries.